Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so today what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit deeper look at industrialization of the late 19th century. So in the last screencast, we kind of touched on how America is expanding and growing. You have great industrialists like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, carving out industrial empires within the United States. And what's happening as far as America's economy itself, it's growing exponentially. But what we're going to take a look at today is, does that filter down to the average factory worker, to the average American citizen? Is everybody sharing in this fantastic prosperity in the United States, or is it a select few? And kind of what's the effects of this on American society in general, and the philosophies within the United States? So the best place to start is kind of the relationship between business and government at the time, and the role that the government plays in facilitating this exponential growth or this huge industrial growth in the United States. So the term that you want to be aware of as far as government's position towards business, towards industry at the time, is something called laissez-faire economics. And quite literally what it means is hands-off economics, which means, as far as the government is concerned, the government's position and idea at the time, for the most part, we're going to debate whether the government is really hands-off towards business, but the philosophy that's out there is that the government does not interfere in business, it doesn't interfere in capitalism, it doesn't interfere in kind of the economic principles of the era. So it's kind of, like the term suggests, pure free market economics, or pure capitalism, where competition rules and the government is not stepping in and playing a role. So things that the government will or should not do if they're following a laissez-faire economic system is they don't regulate prices. They don't step in and kind of set prices for different businesses. They also don't stop monopolies from forming. They don't stop trusts from forming. They don't protect workers' rights. They don't set laws that kind of regulate what can and can't be done within factories. It's kind of all run by what Adam Smith would call the free hand of the market, or the invisible hand of the market. Kind of the consumers are going to dictate what happens and which companies thrive and which companies don't. And so this, in theory, is the government's position towards business at the time. To a large extent, they don't get involved. They don't influence government. They don't influence the businesses. They don't regulate the businesses. They don't regulate the relationship between business and the workers. And so this is kind of a key idea. Now, this is the theory, the economic theory that's out there, that this is the best form or best relationship between business and government that a society could have. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, why did the government take this position? And why do people believe this is the best relationship between business and government? So the reason that they take this position is that leaving business unchecked and kind of unregulated allows for tremendous growth within business. Okay, so you'll often hear businessmen today and conservatives today will say that, the government has too many regulations and too many rules and too many laws, and it kind of hurts growth as far as what the business can do and if it can grow. And so, like, during this time period, you see huge growth, and what the government's thinking is that if business expands and industry expands, it's good for the United States as a country. They're thinking of kind of the long-term benefits of the country. Okay? And so that's, for the most part, why in a lot of these cases they practice a laissez-faire economic system. Now, they don't always practice laissez-faire economic system. Sometimes they do get involved with businesses. So one of the things that you read about in chapter 19, which is this chapter about the West, the government gets very involved in helping out railroads and giving land grants to railroads, and kind of, in certain ways, almost giving them free land. And so that's kind of the complete opposite of laissez-faire economics. Now, again, why did they do it? Well, the government does it in that case because they think that it's benefiting the nation as a whole. So keep in mind, in principle, the government believes in laissez-faire economics in the late 1800s, late 19th century. But they do deviate from that ideology. It's not a strict ideology. So a good comparison to make is kind of when we talked about the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Remember, they believe a certain philosophy, strict constructionism, loose constructionism, but they do bend. And in my opinion, when they bend is when they think it's good for the entire country. Now, there are some huge negatives to this whole idea. So if you leave business totally unregulated and kind of on their own, it invites corruption on many different levels. You're trusting business owners to treat their workers properly, which doesn't always happen. And I think this cartoon's a really good cartoon. It's J.P. Morgan, and then you have Uncle Sam there. And so, like, first of all, look at the sizes. J.P. Morgan kind of dwarfs Uncle Sam in this cartoon, and that's not by accident. It's trying to show their importance in American society. And the second thing that's going on here is basically J.P. Morgan is kind of in the position of power. He's rowing the boat, and Uncle Sam's kind of just like along for the ride with him. And so what's happening here is you do see a lot of corruption within American society. You do see these industrialists, they have so much wealth, so much power, they're influencing the political process in the United States. And a lot of people by the end of this time period, by the 1890s, 1900s, are going to see kind of business and the government as working hand in hand, and they see this as real corrupt. Okay, so this is again something called that is a part of something called known as the Gilded Age, where people believe that this wealth is only kind of like skin deep, and it doesn't really get down to the average person. It also leads to corruption within American society. Now, what we're going to focus on with the second half of this screencast is more kind of what's happening to the people who work in the factories and what are the conditions that they're working in. So because the government doesn't regulate it, it's up to the individual factory owners to set best practices and methods for production and really what's allowed and what's not allowed within factories. And so what happens here is you do see workers' rights not being respected. There's no such thing as a lot of things that we take for granted now: minimum wage, certain work hours, things like that are not present in this late 18th century, 1800s industrialization. Now, what I want to start with is a new idea and a way that factory owners are going to run their particular factories. And the concept that's out there is something called Taylorization, also known as scientific management. So what this is basically applying science to the industrialization process. And what they would do is they kind of would do studies about what's the most efficient way to produce a product. So for example, let's say for example, you're a monitor in the social studies office, and a teacher asks you to staple a test together, and the test has 4 different pages that you have to staple together. Now, if you really think about it, there's many ways that you could set this up. You know, you could set the 4 different pages up, leave the stapler on the table, pick up each page one by one, and staple it. You could hold the stapler in your hand, pick up the different pages, and then staple it. You could ask somebody to help you. You pick up the 4 pages, and then staple it. There's probably 10 or 15 different ways that you could staple those 4 pages for that test together. Now, in a factory, you might say, well, I don't care. But if you own a factory and you run a factory and efficiency is the most important thing to you, what you do is you study it. And you figure out what is the most efficient way to, in this case, staple the test together. What's going to take the least amount of time, because time is money in business. If you waste time, you're wasting money. So business owners would do this. They would scientifically experiment and figure out what is the best way to make a car, what's the most efficient way. And then they would set their factories up like that, and they teach their workers to do a specific task exactly as they taught them to do it. And when they do that, it increases efficiency and therefore increases profits for the company. Okay, so this is kind of taking that whole idea of an assembly line kind of production and then really enhancing it, almost like an assembly line on steroids, where everything has to be done specifically the way that you've been instructed to do it. Now, this increases efficiency, definitely, but think of it also from the worker's perspective. From the worker's perspective, you almost like the human almost becomes a part of the machine. There's no individuality in the work. It's monotonous, it's redundant. You do the same thing over and over and over again. Yes, it's efficient, but it's also mind-numbing, tedious, uh, and you kind of, in a sense, lose your humanness. They almost think of it kind of like they want the human to be a part of the machine. And so this kind of starts to take off during the late 1800s, using this method of production. Now, uh, what's driving all this is profit. Make as much profit as you possibly can. Now, there's different kinds of factories at the time. So what you're looking at here, a lot of these pictures we're going to look at are from a guy named Lewis Hine. He's a famous expose photographer, and he's a good example of a muckraker that we're going to study more in the progressive era. What you're looking at here is an example of a sweatshop. So a sweatshop is specifically a illegal factory in the United States. And so we still have sweatshops today. Usually they'll employ illegal immigrants in modern America because they really have no recourse to complain. In this time period, they also employed immigrants. They're not illegal immigrants. They would employ the immigrants that are coming from Italy and from Eastern Europe. So they might feel like they have no recourse to complain. And in a lot of cases, there are not necessarily labor laws to protect them. But sweatshop is just an illegal factory that might be operating in, you know, somebody's apartment, somewhere that's not designated for a commercial use. And so these are widespread throughout the United States at the time. And it's a way of just creating cheap labor. So another example of kind of a sweatshop, just poor working conditions. You can see the dirt and the filth, and kind of how unkempt they are. And these things, you know, New York City was famous for our textile industry and for our garment industry on the Lower East Side, employed a lot of immigrants. So a lot of these photographs are from the New York City garment industry. These people are doing something called piecemeal work, which is something that my grandmother actually did. So what they would do is they might work in the factory or they might not work in the factory, but they would also take pieces of factory work home with them, and they would do their factory work at night to try and make additional money for their family. And so I don't know if you guys have noticed in the last few pictures, but you see a lot of children employed in industrialization. So there are no child labor laws. So often you would have kids 6, 7, 8 years old, who are employed in industrial factories. And this was kind of accepted in American society at the time. And people, you know, they allowed their children to work in these factories because they need a profit. So a common job within American society at the time for children would be a newsie, and they would go out and kind of sell paper. So you can see this guy, this kid is exhausted. He fell asleep on the subway just from selling too many papers. These kids also just exhausted from working all day. And so remember, this is a different time period, a very different time period, where kids are needed to go out and work. Their families need their income because they're not making enough money alone, so they need their children's income to survive. And so it's a part of growing up and being an immigrant in American society is your extra income was just needed. Now, because you have this growing working class, now, important thing to remember about them is they don't have much to offer but their labor. Okay, they don't have skills, and so they're easily replaceable. So there's not much that they have to bring as a bargaining chip to their employers. Okay, so what's happening is that they're constantly being undercut. Labor is constantly being undercut because they're replaceable, easily replaceable. And so what this means is that it drives wages down and down and down because you have nothing to hold over your employer's head as far as trying to, increase your wage. Now, What happened as a result is you have people who own the factories getting larger and larger amounts of money and becoming wealthier and wealthier. So what we're going to talk about to kind of wrap up the screencast is ideas out there of responsibilities of the wealthy or lack of responsibilities that are believed in for that the wealthy have or do not have. So the first idea that's going to come back, and you've learned about this last year when you talked about imperialism, with European imperialism, something called social Darwinism. So there's a very strong idea that's starting to circulate in America and European society that people are successful for not just for their hard work, but for genetic reasons. So they're starting to tie kind of genetics and ethnicity to success. Okay, so social Darwinism quite simply means applying the idea of Darwinism to human competition and human civilization. So it's the idea that the best of a society, in this case America, will thrive. And it's natural for them to thrive, and it's natural for some people to kind of fail. So in this viewpoint, social Darwinism viewpoint, the wealthy are wealthy because of their inherent superior attributes. And so they're able to succeed in society. And so then they don't necessarily see that they or believe that they have some responsibility to the other people in society because they feel that it's something that they deserve. They deserve kind of their wealth because of their natural abilities and because of their superior genetics. Now, that's one group of industrialists who kind of believe this idea, but not everybody kind of subscribes to this necessarily. And then some people subscribe to social Darwinism and kind of these superiority ideologies at the same time as they believe in other things that are more generous, like philanthropy. So philanthropy is giving back to society. So there are also a lot of industrialists who believe after they get super wealthy that they have an obligation to give back to society at the same time. So the best example of this is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie believes that, he earned his wealth. Like I told you guys in the last screencast, he's a total rags to riches story. But he also believes that the wealthy have a responsibility to society. Okay? Now, note the wording of what I just said is very important. They don't believe that they have a responsibility to the poor or to raise wages for their workers. They believe they have a responsibility to give back to society in general. Okay, so what Carnegie does is Carnegie is going to take a lot of his wealth and he's going to invest it in great public works projects for American society. He's going to build libraries. He's going to build universities, things that the public in general can use. Now, the concept here is very important because it ties into other beliefs that are going on during the late 1800s. This whole idea of improving yourself, self-improvement, okay? Because at the same time that Carnegie is giving back to society, he's also not raising wages for his workers and fighting labor unions and stopping them from trying to get better treatment and better contracts for his workers. At the same time, he's crushing labor revolts. And we're going to talk about that coming up pretty soon. So you might say that the two don't necessarily make sense, but they do if you understand the philosophies. According to Carnegie, like raising his workers' wages and improving their conditions and doing something like that is almost like giving them a handout. It's giving them something they didn't earn, okay? Because like I said before, the workers don't have much to offer but their labor itself, and they're easily replaceable. So in his eyes, they don't necessarily deserve to get increases in wages. Now, on the other hand, through the gospel of wealth, they can improve themselves. They can go to the library. They can study. They can pick themselves up out of poverty, just like he picked himself up out of poverty. Okay, so it's a different but important difference to understand as far as the mentality and the ideology of the era. Now, you also have modern people who kind of are similarly are doing very similar things. So like Bill Gates, for example, is giving a lot of his wealth away. The founder of Facebook, his name escapes me at the moment, but he just last month came out with a pledge that he's going to give almost all of his wealth away. So you have people who are kind of doing similar things in the modern era. And so they're kind of taking a page from Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, and they're doing things, very similar things like building schools, even in New York City. Um, Bill Gates has funded a lot of schools within our charter schools within our city, and so they're doing very similar things to what people have done, earlier in the late 1800s. All right, we're going to wrap it up for today. So make sure, guys, that you take the activities in class seriously. I can't emphasize that enough because I'm probably not going to be back in school for a couple of days. So you really have to kind of take it upon yourself and take ownership of the material and do a good job on your own.